So it's 2020, and sadly, because of COVID-19, there are no motorcycle shows, and that means no Motorcycle Live. But the good news is we're here at the Bike Shed Motorcycle Club in Shoreditch in London, and I'm sitting here with Adrian from Royal Enfield. We've been working on a custom project all summer, and we've been asked to talk to all of you guys about custom motorcycles. We've been given a whole bunch of questions by the audience, by you guys out there, and we're going to do our best to make some sense of them and turn it into an interesting conversation. So Adrian, shall we just jump in?
Let's do it.
So we have a bunch of cards here. Actually, you'll like this question a lot, and I just shook these up randomly. How important is the base bike to the final result?
Oof. Base bike is really important. I mean, it depends on what you want out of it, right? You know, it's a custom bike is about your personality. So, assuming you've got the bike that you think is fitting to you, then it's about making it better. It's about making it, you know, fit to you in a way that nobody else has ever seen that bike before. A base bike can start from something that's you know, completely different as well. It can be something that's very close to what you want. It really depends on what you're looking to get out of the bike. Are you looking to just add a little nip tuck here and there, change the color, or are you looking to completely strip down and make a new bike?
I mean, I think it reminds me of our project over the summer. I think our starting point was if you start with a bike you already like a lot, then it's much easier to build a custom bike. And I always find it extraordinary when people sort of, you know, take scramblers and with long travel suspension, then try and turn them into cafe racers. I mean, you can, but it makes life really, really difficult. The more you have to change, the more you're rebuilding a bike from scratch, and the more you're relying on your skills and the quality of your components. And I think for me, as a person who's not particularly talented at building bikes, lots of bolt-on bits and lots of broken parts along the way, certainly I like to start with a bike that's as near to the final result as possible, so that I have to do the least amount of work to create a bike that's really good, especially these days the manufacturers have gone to all the trouble of making sure that all the components work together and the bike goes around corners and the geometry's right, and you know, it's a competent machine that's going to work on the road. So for me, I think, yeah, absolutely, it's extremely important to get the right base.
Well, manufacturers are more conscious of it now as well. I mean, you know, the current custom scene, you know, is great because a lot of the styles are very applicable to the base motorcycles that manufacturers make already. If you look, you know, 20 years ago, it was all about choppers and so on, and those things were very extreme. You couldn't easily take a base motorcycle and make that into one of them. It took a professional to do it. Whereas now the style has changed to make it so that you can do that with cafe racers and bobbers and so on. It's not that far away from what you've already got in the base motorcycle, and that's been a really nice change, both from, you know, a customization perspective. From the customizer, you have to do less, but also from the manufacturer, it's very exciting for us because it is more closely linked to our product. And obviously that's what we are very interested in seeing, is people picking up our product and doing things with it. So that's been really nice from our side as well to see.
Also, the aftermarket industry's got so good at providing plug and play parts and kits.
It makes that whole bolt-on thing so much easier, so much more possible.
Yeah, and it's always nice to know that you can put bits of the bike back if it doesn't quite go as expected.
Always good to have in your back pocket, just in case.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, that was a good start. So, in no particular order, what have been the biggest trends in bike customization, and what trends are coming up in your opinion? So, over to you first.
Thanks for that. That's a fairly big question. I mean, obviously, you know, retro has been one of the guiding lights of the current custom scene. Getting back to those cafe racer forms, to simplicity. I suppose maybe better than retro, it is simplicity that we're talking about here. In paint finishes, in the way the bike is constructed, you see people removing more than they are adding, or, you know, when they are adding something, it's to make the whole thing simpler, tighter, more focused somehow. Of course, we also see a lot of adventure bikes, that sort of trend. The retro scrambler trend is really big right now. And we don't see that changing that much into the future. Of course, I should also say flat tracking. Flat tracking is a pretty big one. But when we're looking at the future of customization, that is unknown territory in the sense that it just depends on how the current trends go, on how long they last, on how long they work through. And we see the current trends as being really stable, really the simplicity and the retro aspect in particular are things that aren't going away, because we see a culture that is reacting against the complexities of modern life, against technology and so on. And that being a real guiding light for custom motorcycle makers who are trying to get back to that simple riding experience. You're looking just to get on your bike, get out on the road, and that's what and so that's what they're building. That's what people are asking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'd agree with everything you've said. I think for me, look, there's almost a bit of a historical timeline to the way the custom scene has evolved over the last 10 years. When I first got into this world, maybe 2010, 2009, for those first couple of years, it was definitely all about the cafe racer, to the point where the scene was pretty much described as being the cafe racer scene, or the new wave custom scene, as it was called by, I think, Chris Hunter from BikeXif coined that phrase. And a lot of people were working on older bikes. It was CB750s and a lot of BMW R80s, and they were either being turned into cafe racers or kind of what actually, looking back, is brat style. There were a lot of those kind of wide handlebars, sort of a scrambler stance, but slammed down, and then with kind of old school tires and big wheels. So there was definitely that whole kind of cafe into street brat. Then there was definitely the era of the flat tracker, and that was definitely a huge thing, and that seemed to have evolved into the era of the scrambler. And I think alongside the era of the scramblers got more adventure-y.
Well, in line with the broader trend towards a more adventure-style bike.
Adventure bikes have come crashing back into scrambler culture, and everybody's looking to recreate those old kind of Dakar-style bikes.
I was about to say, and we should mention that as well. Getting back into the late 70s and 80s. You're talking about the cafe racer trend being quite big a couple of years back, and now that's more something that's coming out of the 50s and 60s. And as we're moving forward in time, so we're pulling that historical reference forward as well. Now we're getting into the 70s and 80s. As you referenced, you're seeing a lot more bikes with bigger bodywork in that Dakar style, the old Africa Twins and so on, getting very popular as well now. Bikes, again, where you say old CB750, you couldn't give them away. And suddenly they became the bike you had to have, or an R80 or so on. Now, I think we're going to see that same thing, of course, if we aren't already, with those more fared bikes, even sport bikes and so on, coming out of the 80s and now into early 90s maybe, where those are going to become the go-to bike for resto mods and custom bikes and so on.
Yeah, I think with the older platforms, it is about that evolution, because everybody wants the old Tenerés and the Africa Twins, but now they're looking for slab side 750 GSXRs, and I saw some people getting quite excited about the ZRX 750, ZXR 750 with the Hoover pipes coming from the front fairing. And old Fireblades with the cheese grater.
As you move
fairing.
forward, your reference changes. Same with fashion, of course. In really, the custom world and fashion are so inextricably linked somehow, as sort of from their cultural touch points. That just sort of pulls that through, and you just keep advancing as the generation goes on. Its touch point gets a little bit later as well, and so you develop the scene that way.
But I think the biggest trend for me, the biggest change in evolution of custom building, has been the manufacturers getting on board. Because now, in the past, the reason we were customizing old R80s and CB750s and XR600s was because we couldn't find anything else. And the manufacturers' bikes were so far away from what we wanted. Whereas now, everybody's building bikes in that modern retro scene. They're all providing really good catalog parts. The aftermarket industry is providing really good bolt-ons. And I think the biggest shift for me has been a trend of moving away from having to buy an old CB750, restore it. You spend the first £2,000 or £3,000 just making it work properly, and a lot of skill and expertise and balancing a bank of carburetors and doing all sorts of stuff you really don't want to be doing just before you can start turning it into a bike for now. Into buying a brand new bike and customizing that. And that, to me, is the biggest change, because that's a cultural change in that it makes custom building more accessible, because now anyone can do it. And you can go and buy a brand new Royal Enfield 650 or a Triumph or a newer BMW. You can bolt all the bits on that you want and turn it into the bike you want it to be. And you're taking much less risk with the platform. You can still take the bike to your local dealer and get it serviced, but you can make it really quite unique. And I think that's the biggest change of all, has been not just the fashions of what people are building, but the platforms moving from being old bikes you had to source and fix into being brand new bikes you can do anything with that you want to do.
Well, it's also, the manufacturers are listening. They're doing their research. They're looking at the trends throughout the market, and they see this custom thing happening. They see this styles that they can actually act on, and so why not? As manufacturers, it's always very difficult to customize because you can't ever recommend, you can't ever talk about changing the base for legal reasons, for homologation reasons. Motor vehicles are such a complex and heavily regulated thing that to then be able to offer your customers the ability to do this, but legally and within the context of your brand and everything has been a real big advantage. You see it, all the manufacturers are very much realizing that over the past couple of years.
And I think it's also part of the manufacturer's story of moving from being part of the transport industry into actually being in the lifestyle industry.
Quite. Yeah.
I mean, I remember having a conversation with someone from Yamaha saying you've actually got more in common with Yamaha guitars than you have with a car manufacturer. These are instruments. Yeah. They serve a purpose. Like a guitar makes a noise, but it's not a noisemaker. It makes sound, but there's an art to it. And yeah, motorcycles will take you from here to Biarritz, but that's not why people ride motorcycles to Biarritz.
You're making a choice.
Yeah, you get on a plane if you really want to go to Biarritz in a hurry. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we covered that one off pretty well. Let's see what comes next. Where should I start when customizing my bike? Where would you start?
I would start with the base. I mean, we talked about that earlier, but it's about finding that right base for you, and then having the vision to move forward with it. I would think a lot. I think maybe that's a better answer. I would think before I did anything, because you do not want to be in that position where you've just taken apart your motorcycle. It's now unusable as a motorcycle, and you're sitting there with a bunch of parts laid across your floor going, now what? You don't want to be in that position. So, having that idea of what you want, first and foremost, is the most important thing. Then is understanding what you can and can't do as an individual. What's your skill set? Are you able to do, welding? Are you able to do machining? Do you have to reach out to people to do that? That would be my second. And then third is finding the right partners to work with. Because of the growth of the custom scene, there's a wealth of suppliers, of providers, whether they be custom builders themselves or companies specializing in parts that are available to you. And so you can leverage that to spend the time on the creative bit that you want to, and bring in those parts that you don't have to make. And that'll make it so much easier and satisfying for you in the end. It's like you're talking about not wanting to spend all that time, rebuilding an engine before you can actually start building your custom bike. Same thing. Look what's around you. Chances are somebody's already done something pretty close to what you want by way of a mirror or grips or whatever. And maybe even the manufacturer themselves. And so you can take those in and then spend the time on the bits that you really want to make your own and get your personal expression on.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said know your limitations. I mean, that's the starting point, isn't it?
Personal experience?
Yeah, some people seem to inherit a bike or buy something and then they go, right, I'm going to customize it.
Yep.
So they're starting in an unusual place, because they're not thinking about the end goal, they're thinking about their start goal. Like, I've got my dad's bike, or I found this barn find, now what do I do with it? And then, which sets up a whole bunch of challenges, which are about the limitations of the bike and your limitations. But I think there are an awful lot of people out there who could spend a lot more time researching things, because that's one of the things that I come across a lot, is people taking inappropriate platforms and they have a vision that makes no sense. Like the long travel suspension for a cafe racer. For me, you're just making life difficult for yourself unless you know your limitations. But having spoken to a lot of custom builders over the years of all levels, people who are really good, right the way down to idiots like me, the one thing that a lot of people do, which is the same all over, is they take the bike and they take off all the bits they don't like. So you take off the mirrors and you take off the indicators and you take off the fenders and you take off panels and bits, but you try and leave the skeleton of a running motorcycle. So you've got the tank and the engine, and then look at it. And I think that's quite a good place to start if you're not quite sure where you're going.
Yeah.
If you inherit your dad's old bike and you want to do something with it, or a friend's bike, or you just stupidly bid on something
you mentioned
on
that
eBay.
same approach when we were working on our build here.
Yeah, it's like looking at the naked bike and then going, what would I put back on? What stays in a box that's going to live in the attic for the next 20 years and move house every time you move house? And then you see the DNA of the bike, because it's amazing how many people I know look at brand new motorcycles and they complain about the exhausts or the tail or the lighting, and they say, oh, I don't like this and I don't like that and I don't like the mirrors. I say, well, take them off then.
Get rid of that.
Start by peeling off those fork leg reflectors that no one really wants, and take the mirrors off and take the indicators off and take the number plate off, then look at the bike. I think that's a really good starting point. And then step back and look at the bike and go, what goes back on, or what would I replace? Because then you get to almost see that core of what's underneath. And it also shows the limitations as well. If you go, wait a minute, that bike's never going to be that low, or that bike's never going to be that tall. I was talking to a guy about customizing, turning a bike into a scrambler, and I was like, it hasn't got enough ground clearance. You can make it look like one, but I wouldn't go green laning.
You're going to be fighting it the whole time.
You've just given yourself a horrible job. Yeah. But if they stripped it naked first, they might see that.
Of course, you have to know when to stop there as well. You can just keep going.
Yeah, that's true.
Tends to be my problems, and then I'm the guy with the parts on the floor. And
yeah, it sounds like you're speaking from experience.
A little trauma.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at the next one then. So, when customizing a bike, what's the one thing you can do to make the biggest change? I've been asked that before, actually, so I've got a couple of answers, but dive in, because I've got an odd one.
Weirdly, I think the biggest change is honestly color. It's the first thing you're going to notice. Anybody, when you look at a bike from 20 meters out or whatever, you're not going to register the form so much as you're going to register a color. So that would be the number one most noticeable thing you can do, and possibly the easiest thing you can do to personalize something is to change the color. It is going to be obvious to everybody that you've put your stamp on that. Next thing would be the form of the bike, the proportion. If you're going to, if you change that, it's quite an obvious move away from the stock. Obviously, on particularly in the current trends of motorcycle, you don't have a whole lot of body work. So changes to tank are a big way of doing that. Changes to wheel size are a big way of doing. I mean, just on this bike here, moving to 16s over 18s, that was a huge change. Once we got those on, the whole bike fit together. It made sense and that was just the ones. We have the stock tank here. It just so dramatically changed the character of the bike by changing the proportion of the wheels, if nothing else. So that would be color first, would be the most noticeable thing you can change, and then those proportion elements, whether it's the tank or the wheels or whatever, those things that really change how the volumes of the bike fit together.
Yeah, I think I have to agree, wheels particularly, because they're the thing which can change the ride height as well as the silhouette of the bike. And especially when you're changing tires as well. The amount of bikes that are transformed just when you stick on a different set of rim sizes, or stick knobblies on when there weren't knobblies, or slick big round slicks on when there weren't slicks before. That is quite often the biggest, most obvious change to a bike. I think the second thing for me is the handlebars, because how you sit. I mean, obviously going from clip-ons to scrambler style bars to kind of more neutral position, that really changes things. And the combination of wheels and handlebars is quite often the thing that I find is the first part to transform a machine, again, as we found with our little build. But somebody had asked me a long time ago, what's the simplest and most important thing you can change on a bike that makes the biggest difference? And my answer at the time was the front sprocket. Because so many bikes to me are geared for top speed on road tests, and they get given to some guy, and then they ride them on the motorway. And a lot of bikes, especially modern bikes, seem quite overgeared. And my little tip for the best first mod you can do on a motorcycle is put on a smaller front sprocket by one tooth, and it will cost you about £7.50 because it changes the way the bike delivers power to you. It's just a really nice little simple thing. So it's not really about customizing, but I always thought that it was
it's customizing. So far we've been talking about the aesthetics of customization. Now we're talking about the functional attributes. Now, the same thing with getting your suspension set up for you. That's another one that will change your life. If riding a bike around can be night and day if the suspension is not properly set up for you. So,
well, in fact, that's a good tip for anybody watching. I'd say suspension. Best money I ever spent on any bike has always been getting my suspension set up. Front sprocket was the cheapest money I've ever spent on any bike to make an improvement on the bike. So I think that's one completely the two first things. And then the third thing for me is lose weight. And ideally
you or the bike, or
both,
okay.
Ideally. But yeah, changing the exhaust pipe, getting rid of all the heavy bits so it makes good noises, and losing as many kilos as possible in the process. Those are the three things that I think conspire to make some of the biggest changes to how a bike feels to ride. And then if you think about how that also affects the silhouette, like the wheels and the bars, and the color, then you've made massive transformations without really doing that much.
The silencer thing always is a pain point for manufacturers, because it's one of the most expensive parts of the motorcycle, and yet it's the first thing to go. Second thing, you take the reflectors off, and then you take the silencer off, and that's so much time and energy and years of development goes into that thing. It hurts. Whenever you're looking at that, it's like, oh, I love what you've done with it, but that's 2 years of my life gone.
Yeah, and somebody said to me there was £500 worth of platinum in the average catalytic converter on a car.
It's massively expensive because of the precious metals in there.
Wow. Yeah. That's quite sad that we just chuck them in the
right?
bin. Oops, sorry. Sorry, manufacturers. Well, it's a strange order of question, and maybe this sort of feeds back into the last one. How easy is it to customize a bike?
It's all a matter of what you want to bite off, I suppose. It does go back to the previous question of where do you start? How do you go about it? What makes the biggest change? If you're just doing bolt-on, you can really change a lot about the bike through removing bits, putting on different bits, and you have something that's uniquely yours because you've chosen that. If you want to go any further, it's a whole different can of worms.
I guess the answer may be it's never been easier, because there is so much you can just buy. I mean, my first efforts in customizing motorcycles, and I'm not a custom builder or a bike builder, not really. I just bought bikes. I didn't really like what the manufacturer had put on them. So I said, well, who makes something I can change? And so back in the day for me, I'd buy a bike and the first thing I'd do is buy an R&G tail tidy, because they made the rear end of motorcycles look better, and it was a better way to hang the number plate and deal with the lighting at the back end of a bike. And I think there are so many people making tail tidies and alternative indicators for motorcycles that if you change the tail tidy, put small indicators on a bike, throw away the reflectors, change the mirrors, you've done a huge amount to your motorcycle to make it look really different straight away.
You're talking about a couple hours there. Assuming you get all the parts and everything, that's, as far as customization goes, that's makes a big change. Saying even just the tail tidy, getting rid of a mudguard or something, makes a big difference. But you're doing it without a whole lot of time investment or money. Really, it's just those little nips and tucks that can, make a difference between somebody going, that's okay, to, cool. It's a very little thing that way. But if you really want to get into it, you could spend 6 months, a year, building a bike properly for yourself. It just depends what you want to get out of it.
And I think also the other thing is, what makes things easier now than they used to be are forums and the internet. I mean, the amount of times where I've reluctantly discovered the right answer to most things is Google it, which usually annoys the crap out of me. But, if you actually want to know even the component you've just bought from the internet, how to actually put this on my bike, some guy somewhere will have filmed themselves doing it pretty quickly. Yeah. Even on a new model with a new part, give it 6 months, and someone on the internet will have done it.
Within a month or so, somebody will have torn it apart and started doing something to it.
So this is an interesting one. Where do you get your inspiration from when customizing bikes?
I'd say that from all around, personally, I like to just pay attention to, art and music and cinema and so on, and just find interesting things there that I haven't seen necessarily applied to motorcycles before. And so I'll try to pull something from another bit of culture in the world and bring it onto a motorcycle and see what the effect is. We've done that in the past with just in the color and graphic choices, like on our major Roach build, that sort of Mad Maxy thing we did last year. The color scheme came from a manga illustration. Obviously, you can learn a lot from just looking at what's already out there, and if you're looking for a specific style of bike, there's no better place than getting online, as you say, and just scrolling through all the pictures out there and finding that niche where you're comfortable, and then just doing something a little bit more fitting that, I really want a cafe racer, I really want a scrambler, finding all the scramblers out there, and then just give it that little, like your Air Jordans or whatever. It's about having that one that's like the other ones, but just that little bit different. It's this special edition kind of thing that only you and 2 other people have or whatever. That's a really fun thing to do as well.
Yeah, I definitely like the mashup. I mean, I'm not sure that I've got one particular answer to a question like this for me, because my inspiration's usually quite random, and usually I'm going to see another bike. I'm going to see something I like. But I think I'm quite often inspired not so much by seeing bikes on their own, but by seeing bikes in context. It's often about where do I want to go or what do I want to do. At the moment, I'm in London, in a big, smelly urban city, and I'm drawn to bikes that are good for riding around London on, and I see other people riding, and I think about the journeys I have to make, and a lot of my inspiration is about what's the right kick-ass motorcycle to do that job. And we did a few track days this year, so at the moment I've also got a little bit of a side fixation on getting another cafe racer, so I can do some track days with clip-ons where I can get my ear on the ground and be leaning over, hanging off on a bike on a corner. Something I probably haven't really got into for a little while, and that was really about the experience, because motorcycles for me, whilst I love them as things, I love them more with people on them, and I love them even more when I'm on them and I'm doing a thing. And motorcycles are definitely about experience and adventure. So I think my inspiration for every custom bike I've ever had has been, what do I want to do with it? It has often been the starting point. In fact, when I very first got into all of this, my transition into the custom scene was through the Ducati Sport Classic 1000, just when they stopped making them. And I found it to be a really brilliant track day weapon, and I discovered my own limitations riding bikes on track, and I really wanted a retro styled cafe racer with modern performance and brakes and engine and suspension. So it was for the purpose. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, the inspiration's everywhere, isn't it? From Indeed. Steve McQueen jumping motorcycles to whatever. I mean, or Mad Max. I mean, we're surrounded by cultural inspiration as well as taking leads from other things.
Well, there's actually points out to personal functional aspects. When you're designing your custom bike, you definitely want to make sure it looks good from a personal aspect. Because we see so many custom bikes where it looks amazing in the pictures, and then you see the riding shot, and you're just like, what the? Sometimes the thing that looks really cool, in the photo, just is horrible to ride. So make sure, somebody going into customization probably should think about that as well, because usually you only realize that when it's too late and you've already got the paint on it.
Yeah, I always think that with bobbers, with the floating seat. They look really, really fantastic when they've got this little kind of bucket tractor seat sitting there hanging off the back of the tank.
Great at the show, yeah.
And then as soon as you put a person on, they ride up the road, it looks like they're floating. It just looks weird, unless they're set right. Yeah. You need some sort of presence underneath your bum, or it looks really weird.
Well, there's also the difference between motorcycles and cars, right? In a car, you design a cool thing and that's it. And no matter what situation it's in, it's going to look like that. Whereas with a motorcycle, the person is such a part of the vehicle. It's inescapably a part of the vehicle as it's going down the road, that it changes the bike so much. If you're not thinking about it as you're designing your custom, You can have a bike that's absolutely miserable to ride or makes you look like an idiot riding down the road with it if you don't think about the person.
Well, scale's a good starting point, isn't it? Well, I think we're done with the questions. So hopefully that's been entertaining and interesting, and we've whetted a few people's appetites to maybe experiment with customization or modding, or having a go at doing something maybe a bit more challenging. And let's hope that next year won't be doing this and we'll be attending shows instead.
Looking forward to it.